From Capital News, Illinois, it's Friday, March 28th, and this is Capital Cast. Hello and welcome to Capital Cast. I'm Peter Hancock, and I'm here again today with my colleague Ben Szalinski to talk about what is and isn't happening under the dome in Springfield. Ben, thanks for being here.
Hey, Peter.
So, Illinois lawmakers are fast approaching the midpoint of the 2025 regular session. Usually, this is about the time we'd see them start to get serious about putting together a budget for the next year and deciding which major policy initiatives they want to tackle this session. This year, though, it feels like things are sort of stuck in neutral. We just passed the deadline for House and Senate committees to move their non-budget bills to the floor. But so far, neither chamber has passed a single piece of legislation. And it's hard not to think that part of the reason is nobody knows what's going to happen next in Washington that could have a major impact in Illinois. This week, for example, we learned the Trump administration is holding back about $400 million in federal funds for various health programs that Illinois agencies thought they had coming. Ben, you wrote about that. Tell us what's going on with the health money.
Yeah, this is just the latest example, really, for the state of Illinois and funding issues they're having with the federal government. Now, of course, we know that a federal judge has put a preliminary injunction on the Trump administration spending freeze proposal back from January, but that hasn't stopped funding from being cut off for various programs. And in this case, this week, we learned about $125 million that the state was already working on spending that is being pulled back from the state of Illinois from legislation passed by Congress. This funding is for infectious disease prevention programs around Illinois. Is going to local health departments throughout the state. IDPH, the Illinois Department of Public Health, has been using this money to work on improving, vaccine uptake, planning for future pandemic responses, how to combat infectious diseases, how to track infectious diseases. So this is really what the department says a really big blow for the state. And just to add insult to injury, they're expecting that another $325 million that had been set aside for future use by IDPH is also going to be blocked by the Trump administration.
Okay, and this is money, correct me if I'm wrong, but money that Congress has appropriated. Is that right?
Exactly. This is from the CARES Act, which was signed by President Trump in 2020. So the president has already approved of this funding for the state of Illinois. But more importantly, it was appropriated by Congress, which means a lot of folks say that the president has no real ability. The executive branch, in this case, the CDC, has no ability to just say, no, we're actually not going to spend this money at all, because Congress mandated that this money is to be spent and it's supposed to go to the state of Illinois. So this is raising all sorts of legal questions and the possibility of more lawsuits yet again from the Illinois Attorney General trying to challenge all these executive orders and issues and things coming out of Washington, because this is funding that the state was legally owed by Congress, because Congress is the one who controls the power of spending and taxing and revenue in the United States. It's not unilaterally controlled by the executive branch.
And so it's also happening at a time, you mentioned monitoring infectious diseases. There are measles outbreaks. I don't know if you would call it yet an epidemic, but there have been significant outbreaks of measles, especially among unvaccinated people in other states. I don't think Illinois has quite made the list yet, but do you get a sense that people in the Department of Public Health are concerned about their ability to keep tabs on this? And you talked about, trying to bring up the vaccination rate. Is there concern within the agency about their ability to stay on top of the situation without those federal funds?
Yeah, IDPH Director Dr. Samir Vora, he said in a statement that this is going to have, quote, debilitating impacts on the state's ability to handle infectious disease fights. And, of course, this comes as right now the big talk is about measles and, the possible spread of this virus that has largely not been a big issue in the United States for many, many, many years, starting to spread more through a more unvaccinated population. And IDPH is believing that with this funding being lost, they're going to have a harder time tracking this and responding to it and planning for potentially a bigger outbreak of measles or something else. Bird flu is something that we're talking a lot about these days, and the possibility of some sort of transmission to humans and then in between humans, which would lead to major issues for public health. That's another area that IDPH cited that they could have trouble, responding to major outbreaks on this. And of course, we know from the last 5 years how the state has responded to COVID-19. There's been a significant amount of planning done at IDPH since the pandemic began and since orders have ended on the pandemic. So we really know that this is going to have pretty big impacts throughout all of public health, responding to all sorts of issues that come up.
So, also this week, in sort of a related story, Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul joined with about 20 other Democratic AGs across the country in asking a federal court to block the dismantling of the U.S. Department of Education. Earlier this month, President Trump issued an executive order to begin dismantling that department. Illinois public schools get about $3 billion a year or more from the Department of Education. Much of that is for special education services. Other money goes for supplemental funding for what are known as Title I schools. Those are located in the nation's poorest communities. In addition to K through 12 education, college students in Illinois get about $1 billion a year in Pell Grants. That's not to mention the guaranteed student loans that they rely on that are administered by the Education Department. So as part of that effort to dismantle the agency, Trump is now asking the Small Business Administration to take over the processing of student loan paperwork, and he wants to move special education functions over to the Department of Health and Human Services, which we just learned this week is about to go through its own massive downsizing under its new Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Ben, you and I have both been asked recently what's the mood like in the State House these days. Given all of this, I guess my general take on it might be to say it's sort of stunned disbelief. But, given all of this, how would you describe the mood in the State House and what kind of impact this is having on just the normal legislative process we would otherwise be covering right now?
Yeah, I think my word for it would be a lot of anxiety for it. Democrats are the ones who control everything that's happening here in Springfield, and they're very clearly worried about all the things you mentioned and more that's coming out of Washington. Sometimes it feels like they're just sitting around waiting for the next shoe to drop and to try and figure out how they're going to respond to it. But I think a lot of lawmakers are also in the category of they have no idea how they're going to respond to it because some of these issues are just so unprecedented, so big, too big for the state of Illinois to respond to in some cases. So I think on the Democrat side, at least, there's a lot of anxiety over what does all this mean for the state? What does this mean for them and their legislative agendas? But I think on the Republican side of the aisle, this has just caused a lot more tension when you combine the two chambers. Basically on a daily basis in the Illinois House, at least, we're seeing basically daily yelling back and forth about something that Donald Trump or his administration has done in the last few days. This is often launched into, a Democrat will get up and give a speech about the latest thing that they despise that the Trump administration has done. And then a Republican will follow it up by saying, frankly, the opposite, that whatever Trump is doing is great, that Democrats don't really care about the people of Illinois. And this has just been this constant back and forth while lawmakers are essentially not passing any legislation at the moment. They haven't moved a single bill forward yet. So whether this plays into a distraction or some sort of delay for the General Assembly remains to be seen, but we're getting very close to that point, I think, where this becomes just an outright distraction and cause for delay in the legislative process.
Well, and it is kind of interesting to see the power dynamic going here because normally Republicans have no power in Springfield. They are in a significant minority in both the House and the Senate. They don't occupy a single statewide elected office from the governor on down. But in Washington, Republicans are holding all of the power. And so, like you say, when it comes to those speeches on the floor, they still do meet pretty much every day on the floor of the House, even though they're not conducting a lot of business. They rise for what are called a point of personal privilege, and they'll make a speech about whatever topic is on their minds at that time. And so, at least in that setting, it's like Republicans are feeling a little bit empowered right now because even though they may not have the ability to push legislation in Springfield, they know that there's a Republican president and a Republican Congress that is pretty much dictating the circumstances from on high. Do you get a sense that their Republicans are feeling a little bit emboldened by that?
Yeah, and I think they believe that what's happening now in Washington and the results, frankly, of the election are they think that this should demonstrate to Democrats that, hey, maybe you should actually listen to the Republican Party a little bit on some issues. And I think that's kind of where they're coming from. They see that, several things that Donald Trump has done are popular, that he was obviously elected by a popular margin in this country. And they think it's kind of time for Democrats in Illinois to maybe give in a little bit on some of their issues. These may not be issues as big as some of the things we talk about at the national level, but maybe some more smaller things like letting Republicans kind of say their piece about ways to make life more affordable for people in Illinois, for example. That's one they talk about all the time. So I think they aren't really sure maybe what to do with some of this newfound political momentum that they seem to have found. And this is kind of their way of expressing it, and a lot of back and forth. Whether Democrats in Illinois want to embrace it, they really certainly don't have to accomplish anything. But I think Republicans believe that the eye is on them now, and they have the ability to be louder and more effective in their messaging.
Well, and speaking of Republicans being out of power, I want to turn to one other issue. They would tell you that their lack of power in the House and the Senate is not necessarily the result of their inability to win elections, but rather how legislative districts are drawn. And to their point, if you look at statewide elections for governor, for U.S. senator, for secretary of state, for whatever, Republicans tend to get about 45% of the vote. It's about a 55-45 state in Illinois. But they don't have anywhere near 45% of the legislative seats. They say that's the result of redistricting. There is now yet another lawsuit that is headed to or is pending before the Illinois Supreme Court. This goes back to the way new maps were drawn following the 2020 census. Many of us thought we were done with that issue. It's now 2025, but evidently not. Ben, fill us in. What's going on with this latest redistricting lawsuit?
Yeah, the Illinois House Republican Caucus, led by Tony McCombie, has filed this new lawsuit that essentially is asking the Illinois Supreme Court to overturn the maps and order a special master to redraw the maps. They're making an argument here that the map is illegally gerrymandered, was drawn clearly for partisan gain because Lisa Hernandez, the now chair of the Democrat Party who led the map-making process, said just as much on the House floor when these maps passed. Their other argument is going back to a 1981 Illinois Supreme Court ruling that threw out a legislative district because it wasn't considered compact enough. So they brought out a bunch of measurements, essentially measuring the current House districts in the General Assembly. And the measurements found that about half of the current legislative districts would actually fail that test, the Supreme Court ruled on in 1981. So they believe that this is enough cause to just completely redraw the maps. One of the things that we saw come up this week is that the Democrat caucuses in both chambers for Speaker Welch and President Harmon They filed a brief in response to this. They've asked to intervene as defendants. The defendants were the State Board of Elections, but the Attorney General has filed on behalf of the State Board saying that we don't really have an opinion on whether this lawsuit brought by McCombie is timely. So what Democrats argued in their response this week to this is that no, in fact, this is not timely, that yes, we should be done with this issue because it is 2025. We've seen 2 election cycles go now. And, Republicans have been making this claim literally since the maps were introduced that they aren't compact and are gerrymandered. So they should have just brought the lawsuit 5 years ago when these maps were enacted. So that's really the basic gist here, is that we're not really sure where the Supreme Court is going with this issue. They've asked for responses. So they're going to be weighing whether, I think the main question is if it's too late for Republicans to file this. And what Republicans are saying is that they needed 2 election cycles to show trends and patterns, to be able to actually prove that these legislative districts are gerrymandered. So they believe that now that 2 cycles have come and gone, there's more data to actually show that these maps were legally drawn, they're not compact, and they hope that the Supreme Court is going to take up the case and rule favorably for them.
Okay, and just to be clear, there was, in fact, a federal lawsuit immediately after the new maps were passed. Republicans, as well as some other groups, went to federal court claiming that the maps diluted minority voting power, specifically in the Chicago area and the Metro East area. And a 3-judge panel up in Chicago in federal court threw those claims out. But in the background, there was this, you can tell that there has been a shifting opinion or a shifting view about gerrymandering in federal courts. The U.S. Supreme Court has basically said, as far as they're concerned, political gerrymandering is okay. There's nothing against that. But at the state level, in the state constitution, and I think that's what this lawsuit that we're talking about now is based on, the state constitution does not allow for political gerrymandering, or at least that's the claim the Republicans are making. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think it's also worth pointing out that we've seen this show before. We've seen lawsuits over the maps. In 2011, after that decade's maps were passed, Republicans in the General Assembly did the same thing. They brought lawsuits trying to challenge the maps. They were unsuccessful in these challenges. The Supreme Court then in 2016, there was a voter initiative to get a referendum on the ballot to create a independent map-making commission for the General Assembly. The Supreme Court threw that one out too. So there hasn't really been a lot of success as far as what Republicans are asking for. And, the court is different than it was in 2016, and, it's changed over the years, but the bottom line is also that the court is currently full of elected Democrats on the court, and they are also elected in their own court districts, which are drawn by the General Assembly for their gain.
I was going to say the same General Assembly that draws legislative maps also draws state Supreme Court district maps. Illinois is the only state in the union, as far as I know, that elects Supreme Court justices by geographic districts, which is kind of interesting. And when they redrew the legislative maps, they also redrew Supreme Court maps. So you could say that the members of the Supreme Court owe their political fate to the legislature. Given that, there's some doubt that the Supreme Court is going to jump in and say, oh, no, legislature, you're not allowed to do this. You've done it all wrong. Because without those maps, they wouldn't be there.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what we're waiting for next is, if the Supreme Court wants to take this up, it will certainly be really interesting to see how they approach the case. Certainly, obviously, how they rule, but what kind of questions are they asking? Because some of them certainly do owe their seat on that bench to districts that were drawn kind of favorably to their party. So we'll be watching for that. But right now, we really don't know if the court is going to take this up or even when it takes it up. The argument Republicans are making now is that they should take it up now because we're not in an election cycle. The next election cycle doesn't start till later this summer when petition passing for 2026 begins. So they think it's timely to get this done and out of the way in the next few months. But the court also really doesn't need to go any further with this case. They could ignore it essentially, and that would probably be also a rather telling sign from the justices.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have for this edition of Capital Cast. Before we go, I do want to give a shout out to our two interns this year from the University of Illinois Springfield's Public Affairs Reporting Program, Bridget Fox and Jade Aubrey. In addition to their own reporting, they've given us invaluable help in covering a lot of stories, including the ones that we talked about here today. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation, with significant funding from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. Until next time, on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team, this is Peter Hancock saying thank you for listening.